welcome to episode 3 of The Brood Sages. I am Freeloader, and as always, I'm here with Subaiku. Subaiku, how are you?
Fantastic. How are you doing tonight?
Well, with a little bit of this Elijah Craig, I am doing better and better. Also, we have had a fantastic week. We found a new home for our podcast on the official server, stormbound-kitty.com, which we gave a great shout out to last time, and I'm proud to be a part of that website. TuneIn and Spotify have both picked us up this week, so we are increasingly looking like this hobby is getting out of control, and I have to admit, I'm starting to get a little nervous.
There's definitely some pressure to produce now, both in terms of frequency and quality.
Oh dear. Well, to that effect, a quick apology to everyone from last time. Our audio quality was not to the level that we expect out of ourselves. And to that point, Sabaiku was kind enough to shell out some dough and picked us up some Audio Technica microphones. So hopefully we have the audio issues taken care of.
I want to point out, though, that no amount of gear is going to make us any more professional or qualified to do this. You're going to get the same mess you're going to get any other time.
Absolutely, it'll just sound better. So we like to start off each episode with a little recap of our past week. I'll let you go first this time, if you don't mind.
Last week, really, I've been spending most of my time on the ladder. The brawl this week was the pirate speed equals 2, which is not my favorite to play. It really ends up being over very quickly, depending on who's got higher level lucky charmers, and that's not great fun. So I spent more of my time on ladder. I managed to push it all the way through platinum up to platinum 1, so I'm knocking on the door of diamond already.
Wow.
Feel like if I had a little more time to play, I'd be there right now, but I'm happy with the pace that I'm going. I've been playing my Shadowfen Rush deck. It's really carried me the last 4 months, I think, and I haven't changed much except, as we talked about last week, the addition of Unhealthy Hysteria. I put that in for Faithless Prophets. It has paid dividends. It has definitely won me some games, even at level 2, where it's only affecting units of 6 strength or less. It just gets that extra bit of chip damage or clears the lane that I need, and it's been working really well.
Dude, shell out some fusion stones and bring that up to level 3.
It's in the plans. It's probably the next card I upgrade.
Ah, okay. I like that. To the brawl point, I made it to the fusion stones as usual. A little bit bumpier this time. I've been noticing like 2 or 3 of the last 4 or 5 brawls. I'm finding fewer and fewer people with similar base health to mine as I climb. I don't know if more of them are just giving up or if there's suddenly a larger preponderance of people at like 18, 19, 20 base health who are playing later in the brawl each week. But I will say that I made it without Lucky Charmers. Shout out to Critical Pancake this week for a phenomenal deck that he posted, and Bugs suggested I look it up. It topped out at 4 mana, and it only ran 3 pirates or 4 pirates. It had witches at 4. It relied on North Sea Dog as your runner effectively, along with Cabin Girls, and I think Westwind Sailors was the only other pirate in the deck, and the rest of it basically was just Rain of Frogs to stop runners, Rain of Frogs to stop runners, smack them in the head a couple of times, and then win with the North Sea Dogs, and it worked great.
So just relying on an overwhelming number of units, they can't clear everything, and that allows you to push the damage from pretty much anywhere on the board.
Exactly. My week was also not spent too much doing my normal stuff because normally I'm just, I do brawl and some laddering. But this week I have been trying Reckless Rush's draft tournament that he ran. He wrote a bot that allows you to draft it. It gives you the option of 2 out of the 4 factions. You select it, and then it gives you the option of 3 cards at a time, 12 times. So you literally draft out of one of 3 choices for times 12, and now you suddenly have a deck ready to go. The last card offered each time is a legendary, and the rest of it is just kind of he insists there's some amount of formulaic repetitiveness to what's being offered. If we could crack that code, we could find some advantage, sort of a thing. But I did not notice. All I noticed is that my opponent this week, Dirk, had one of the best decks I've ever seen out of a draft. Granted, I have very little history with it, but it looked. But his first round and second round decks both looked like they were selected rather than drafted. They were very good decks. He also played phenomenally well. Meanwhile, I base locked him right into Flood the Gates, so that shows you how good of a player I am. So I'm sadly now out of this tournament, but I have to say, having played the first two rounds, it was really fun and engaging. Getting to redraft a new deck each round was really cool. And I hope to try it again. And if any of you out there are looking for something a little different, this was definitely an off-meta tournament. You're not running into, even if you play a lot of equals, this was definitely different than a standard equals tournament. So it was very engaging.
So you say it offers you cards from the collection every round of the draft. How
Hmm.
does it deal with the fact that some people have incomplete collections? Like I'm missing Dr. Mia.
You tell the bot before you begin the draft. There's a way to give it the input to begin the draft where you say, I want to run a draft without X, Y, and Z cards. And then that's that. For me,
Interesting.
it wasn't an issue since I do have a complete collection now. But I imagine for a lot of people who didn't buy the Sheepyard pack, for example, who don't have the Rogue Sheep, not that that's very likely to be a card that's offered, but just in case, you tell it what you don't have, and then you won't see it.
Neat. Sounds very interesting. Sounds like a different way to play the game. Sounds like something that's more akin to an arena mode, and I hope that it's something that Sheepyard thinks about adding in the future.
Yeah, it was very cool. And this is actually the second time I've tried out one of Reckless's ideas. He had another one where he made like instead of trying to hit your opponent in the face to win a game, you had to hold certain cells on the board for multiple turns. And I've got to say that was also incredibly fun and very different from anything else I've done in Stormbound. So he's got quite the mind. And yeah, if Sheepyard has some time, they should sit him down and just talk to him about different game modes and different styles of play that they might want to add into the game because they are fun and it feels fresh. Moving on from how our week was, we're just going to touch very briefly on the news this week because there's very exciting news. Stormbound is going to be celebrating this coming week its third anniversary, and Shipyard has a whole bunch of stuff planned. They've dropped some hints, but they have not given us too much in the way of specifics. We know that there's going to be at least some packs that you'll be able to buy in the store that have additional cards, and potentially other things are going to be discounted, although we don't know specifically what or by how much, although we've been told to think about the number 3 and what that might mean, since it is the third anniversary. I'll just say that they've also suggested that you won't be punished for hoarding resources. I'm sad to say that we found all this information out fairly recently, so we haven't been able to share it in the previous podcast. And this episode will go live like effectively the same day that the anniversary stuff starts because it will start with the brawl.
Quite possibly. By the time you listen to this, you'll definitely know more than we know right now.
And so, because of that, I will simply say that the other news is that we have our new home. Huge shout out again to Kitty for offering to give us some space on the Stormbound's official site, and you can now find us basically anywhere. And that's about it for the news. We don't want to speculate too much about what might be coming in the anniversary because, again, as Subaiku points out, you know more when you're hearing this than we know as we're saying it. So it really does nobody any service to speculate about what may or may not happen. And instead, we thought we would devote the rest of this episode to a conversation which was actually, I think, one of the first conversations that you and I had, Subaiku, that we said, you know what, this is something that we probably should have and share with the community.
So early on, when we started playing Stormbound, we were really puzzled by the elder cards and fact that some of them were obviously very, very strong and the rest were merely balanced. We wanted to talk about the interesting mechanics behind them, how they fit into the game, how they fit into each particular faction, and the relative power level of the ones that remain, a lot of the elders were changed.
Yeah, although none of them were fundamentally changed. In general, it felt to us when we got started like the elders were sort of the superheroes of each faction, right? So a faction has a mechanic, let's say the command mechanic, and then the faction gets a elder, petrified fossils, that plays off of that mechanic in a way that is either slightly different than any other card in the set or more powerful than any other card in the set. So you could see if you had a lot of small minions on the board, even Herald's Hymn only affects one row. Petrified Fossils could affect every minion potentially or unit potentially on the board, depending upon sizes and levels and stuff. So it could be a more powerful Forgotten Souls. It's more expensive, so maybe that makes sense. But just sort of as a new player looking at it, it looked like the Elders were these supercharged, super powered versions of other cards within each faction.
And the mechanics within each faction, notwithstanding, the elders are obviously very powerful because of the basic mechanic that they have. They all have relatively high strength for their mana cost, one of the exceptions being petrified fossils, and hence why you don't see that played very often.
And scrapped planners being the other.
No, the scrapped ones, man, those see play in a lot of Rush Ironclad decks.
Well, yes, but they don't have a rather large health for their mana.
They have a moderate health for their mana. More
Okay,
so
that's
than,
fair.
say, they have a balanced health for their mana. How's that?
Ooh, that's very accurate.
More than Warfront runners, but with less movement, and I think that that's pretty fair.
Okay.
But because the Elder mechanic being a trigger when the unit is surviving damage means that it has to survive a trade in order to trigger, and ideally survive multiple trades in order to trigger multiple times. And that's really something that adds to that superpower mystique, I think, is the fact that it's this big unit, and if it sticks around, it's going to just win you the game.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. I would say that in general, they're a more late game strategy card than a lot of rush cards, and a lot of rush style decks don't necessarily want elders. But when you're playing with a newer deck and you run into somebody who's running, I don't know, like an over leveled winter deck for the league you're in, right? So they're playing all level fours or level fives, and they drop this just giant Earth Fathers, and you're like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do against that? And then they buff it. And then it buffs itself when it wins trades, and you're just scratching your head just watching this inevitability march down the side of the board. It can be a little dispiriting at first until you learn how to play around some of them, and in some cases you can't play around some of them. There are turns, I'm looking at you, Hairy Chestnuts, I'm looking at you, Booming Professors, where your opponent can trigger them 2 or sometimes even 3 times in the case of Hairy Chestnuts, and the game's over. You own the front, they're not in striking distance, but it doesn't matter. Suddenly out of nowhere, this unit drops, it does a couple of things before your opponent hits end turn, and then they hit end turn, and it does it one more time at the start of your turn, and you're dead. And there was a certain amount of, I think, lack of interactivity with these cards. Some of these cards can just be played, and without you ever having the opportunity to respond, the game is over. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes and no. I think Booming Professors is maybe the one that did not get rebalanced that maybe could use another look. But in general, that's the only one that has the ability to really close out a game like the way that you're saying. And even if it doesn't close out the game, it can do a pretty significant chunk of damage in a very short period of time.
Oh,
Con-
it can
contrast
take
that
out
with
50% of your life.
Contrast that with, say, Hairy Chestnut, which does chip away at the opponent's life total, but doesn't have the movement. So, in order to trigger on your own turn, you have to play, say, Toxic Sacrifice, or which is something to yourself to trigger it. So, you can't just drop it on 6 mana and get an effect out of it until you hit end turn and it's your opponent's turn. And
That's
then they have
that's
a
very
chance
fair.
to respond to it before it does more.
That is fair. Without any additional help. Booming professors can do 10 points of damage to you. And even if you have a max base health, that's 50% of your life total. On curve, no additional help, no combo from hand. It can
Now
do.
you can play around that as the opponent. You can not put multiple units in a column and try to alleviate that if you suspect your opponent is playing booming professors.
I mean,
There is
yes.
counter.
Is there adequate counterplay? I mean, you can say there's counterplay to flooding the gates by simply never putting a unit on your opponent's baseline, but that's also how you win. So if the counterplay is to play a losing style of the game, a losing style of your deck, then that's not really counterplay.
There's a big difference between not attacking your opponent's baseline and just avoiding putting two units in the same column, two weak units in the same column. Because Booming Professor's health is not huge. If you have two mid-strength units, two fives, two sixes, they're going to destroy the professors before the second trigger happens.
All right, well, let me ask you this. If you have, let's say, a 6 health unit and a 4 health unit that you can tuck into the corner and an adjacent column of your opponent's baseline, do you not, in order to prevent Windmakers from having an effect on those two units, do you not put, if possible, an additional unit? If it can't go into column 3, do you not put it on column 2 behind the first unit to stop the Windmakers?
Yes, that's fair. But in that situation where he plays booming professors instead of wind makers, he's probably spending all his mana playing the booming professors and still taking the damage and allowing you to keep your front. And then you can continue to attack.
If the game isn't over, he just did 10 damage to your face. I mean, if he hasn't done any damage to you yet, okay, fine, yes, the game can continue.
Yes,
If
well, you probably have, if you're facing level 4 or level 5 booming professors, your base health is probably more than 10.
Well, ideally, yes, but if he's done any damage to you already. See, the issue that I have with booming professors is if I'm playing base health 20, right? And let's say I am a base health 20 as well, and we go back and forth. One of the two of us, I'm playing, let's say, Swarm. One of the two of us is obligated to deal 20 points of damage to their opponent. The other one is only obligated to deal 10 points of damage to their opponent, and then can effectively lose control of the board, lose front, and still just win the game.
I think that you're oversimplifying that, and it's not as easy to A, outrush your opponent like that, and B, lose control of the board but still have enough control to set up how your chip damage falls.
Lest we forget, this is the class that has push and pull. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy, but let's have this conversation. There used to be the possibility, and in fact, there still kind of is, even though its health has been reduced. It's more difficult now. But you used to see fairly often 9 points of damage done by Hairy Chestnuts. Level 5 Hairy Chestnuts into Witch's Toxic Sack, and then end turn, your opponent's unit hits the Hairy Chestnuts for the third hit. That's 9 points of damage to face. And Sheepyard, I think rightly, looked at that and said, that's too much. That's too much damage done to face from a losing board position where you have, you are not the aggressor. You are on your own side of the board. Your opponent's doing all of the aggressiveness. You're basically just trying to play defense and survive, and suddenly you just 9 them to the dome. That seems a little unfair. And even though that's a 3-card combo, it's a little too easy to deal 9 to face.
I want to point out that 3-card combo is A, still intact, B, still costs the same amount of mana, so it's just as effective.
Yes, but with Hairy Chestnuts being less health, the odds that it can then take the hit from the additional unit at the start of your opponent's turn are less. It's still easy to get 6 points of damage off the Hairy Chestnuts, but getting that last bit of damage off of it is no longer as easy as it used to be, and that's part of the reason why you don't see Hairy Chestnuts being played as much. It was nerfed. Its effect wasn't nerfed. It still, at level 5, deals 3 damage to your opponent's face and heals itself for 3. But its base health being reduced means that it's just that little bit more difficult to set it up to make it work. And as such, it's stopped being a viable. I mean, I don't even want to say viable. It is still viable. It's just a little too difficult to make happen. And so there's just better options within the Shadowfen and neutral library.
And I don't agree with that. I think that the decrease in strength just made it balanced. It's still perfectly viable if you want to run it. I've had success running it after the change.
Oh,
I
so have
will
I.
agree.
Are
I
you
will agree
saying you
that
don't
they change.
you see it as often as you used to?
I do not at
Okay.
lower levels, but I do still see it at level 5 with about the same frequency as I used to, which is admittedly not that frequent because not that many people have it leveled up 5. But my
I
point
do
is,
not.
the two strength that got knocked off of it made it balanced, made it reasonable. The effect is still unreasonably good, so there's no penalty to running it. The problem that I have running it now is actually not that the card isn't as good. It's just that the decks that I'm playing seem to have gotten faster. I no longer face slower winter pact deck. I face instead an aggressive ironclad deck, and it's just not good in that situation.
That's fair. Yeah, the nerf to winter really did lose one of the best reasons to run Harry Chestnuts. I'll concede that point, but I do feel like it was harder to deal 9 with Harry Chestnuts than it ever was and still is to deal 10 with Booming Professors. But one of the two got the nerf hammer, and the other one skated through fine.
Look, Harry Chestnuts costs less mana and has a stronger body and heals itself when it does damage. Like it is a stronger card. It was a stronger card. It needed the change. I don't have any problem with that.
Oh, I don't have any problem with the nerf to Harry Chestnuts. I have the problem that Harry Chestnuts got nerfed and Booming Professors, which by the way is the same cost, not less or not more. It is this. It costs the same as Harry Chestnuts. They're both 6.
You got me there.
And at level 5, by the way, Booming Professors could deal 12. It deals 6 of its remaining damage, so it can deal 12 in one turn with no help. Just a board state that's adequate.
Which is not enough.
No, no, that's my point.
But booming professors, you can play around through positioning, and Harry Chestnut heals itself. I think you're comparing apples and oranges here.
I am not convinced that you can play around booming professors adequately in a way that allows you to win the game.
So you're saying there should be no penalty when you have to adjust to your opponent's cards?
No, I am simply suggesting that the ability to deal over 50% of your opponent's total life total at max health, let alone, let's say, 16, 17, 18, whatever, but at 20, it's over 50% of your opponent's life total. And being able to do that without needing any sort of combination of cards, with just needing an adequate board state, is a little dangerous and it's a little uninteractive. And there could be a balance with it for sure. I think we've hit it with Harry Chestnuts now, but I don't think we've hit it with Booming Professors. I feel like Booming Professors, look, Booming on turn 8, it can deal 12 with just itself and Destructobots and no other units on the board for you. It just needs to win a trade in a row with or in a column with no other units, and then Destructobots be played anywhere, and the game is over. So all I'm suggesting is that it is a little too easy to win a game with Booming Professors now without needing to ever play across the board. And if the goal of this game, if the reason why Stormbound exists is because it allows for this fun interactive board that you have to play units on and trade through and find paths to make it from one end to the other, having one of the two players say, all I need to do is land 8 damage to your face and then I can just kind of give up, fall back, and wait till I cycle through to my booming. That's really not the level of interactivity that I think makes Stormbound as fun as it can be. And the reason why I think I'm right in that is because when I look at what Harry Chestnuts was able to do, Sheepyard looked at that and said, well, it's getting a little out of hand. And I think they were right to have nerfed Chestnuts. So my question is, why not also nerf Booming Professors?
I would suggest that they haven't nerfed booming professors because booming professors is not a problem. I understand the ability to strike from across the board for a pretty significant chunk of damage is a problem, but that's like saying Siege Assembly and Mia is a problem because it's a 2-card combo that costs about the same amount of mana and it can just strike across the board like that.
Well, it can't do anywhere near as much damage, and it can shoot once a turn. That's very different. To your original point of what made the Elders so interesting is they can be activated more than once in a turn. If Booming Professors could only deal 5 or 6 damage in a turn, okay. So, I mean, to that point, thank you for bringing it up. My suggestion for how to fix Booming is to simply take away the movement. If it had no movement, the best it could do on any given turn is 1 ping, and I think 1 ping is appropriate for it. 2 pings is getting a little insane at 6 points of damage each.
Again, to get 6 points of damage each, it has to be trading into 1s and 2s. Like the base health on the unit is not that strong. In order to get multiple triggers, the unit in order to get multiple triggers at 6 damage or at max damage, the unit needs to survive trades with 2s, 3 and 2 at like doesn't even do it. Like it has to be 2 2s or a 3 and a 1 or 2 1s. Like it's just not that much of a problem because you don't see low level units across the board unless you are specifically playing against a swarm deck or a Shadowfen deck that's going real wide. And if you're going real wide, you have other units that can soak up the damage. So it's not even hitting your face. At max level, it's a 10 strength unit. It's just not big enough to get multiple triggers consistently the way that you're describing.
That was not the attitude that everyone had for Chestnuts, so I don't understand why Chestnuts is different.
Because the Chestnuts A has a much larger health pool. It was 15 at level 5. Now it's down to 13, I believe.
At level 5, yeah, I think that's correct.
Right, so right there, that's a huge discrepancy. And then the Chestnuts heal themselves after they take damage. So you could have a unit on the board, play the Chestnuts next to it, Toxic Sacrifice your unit, damage the Chestnuts, it would take 5 and then heal back up another 3. Everything else in the area would take 5 and be significantly weakened, while your unit only netted 2 damage. So now, like that's a big swing. The problem is not that the hairy Chestnuts would consistently deal 9 damage, 12 damage on the same turn. That's improbable. The problem was that the hairy Chestnuts would dick and allow those triggers to happen over multiple turns because they were so hard to get rid of.
Your concern is that with 3 cards in hand, you could make, let's say, 9 points of damage to your opponent's face and still have a large unit left over, correct?
I'm saying that it was powerful.
Give me 3 cards in my hand. Can I get 3 cards in my hand? I would like Booming Professor's Unstable Build Fortification Tonic. If you're gonna say, well, with these 3 cards, it could deal a lot of damage and still be a big unit. Well, with 3 cards, I can deal a lot of damage and still have a large unit. But my point is, the game is over.
You're not.
My
You're
point is
misinterpreting. You're deliberately misinterpreting what I said there. The
Ooh.
problem is not that the hairy Chestnuts can deal a lot of damage from hand. The hairy Chestnuts cannot consistently deal a lot of damage from hand. The problem is the hairy Chestnuts can deal a little bit of damage and are still very hard to clear, regardless of what your opponent had on the board. If you just were able to put them down on 6 or 7 mana, they're just tough to clear because they're a high strength unit that then heals itself whenever it takes a trade. You'll notice that when Sheepyard balanced the unit, they did so by removing the strength, not by reducing the chip damage, because the chip damage wasn't actually the concern.
Interesting.
Now, Booming Professors, the chip damage is a lot higher than the Hairy Chestnuts, but it doesn't heal itself. It's hard to get multiple triggers because your opponent has to play into multiple triggers, and yes, it can move, but like it's just not as strong of a body, so it matters less.
It's interesting because the way I played both cards when I've played with them was effectively the same. I'd never play either on 6 unless I was already in total control of the game. What I would do is I would take additional gambles with the rest of my deck such that on turn, let's say 8, 9, or 10, I would 2-card or 3-card combo something with Booming or something with Chestnuts to get the last bit of damage. In that play style of I'm just going to rush you, smack you as hard as I can, get you within striking distance of my Elder, I have found that Booming is actually better and easier to get damage off than chestnuts because I'm less reliant of other cards in hand. Now, the one problem for me is that my Booming Professors is level 3 and it only deals 4. So I can usually get 8 out of it, which is not terrible, but not fantastic.
Well, it's usually about 50% of your opponent's health.
Oh, I wish I was playing against 16s. If I was playing against 16s, I don't need to really play the Booming in the first place. Um, but
Well,
but
you're
in all,
not playing against anything more than 17 now.
well, that's true. But yeah, so I have found that the booming professors are actually, because you go all out, you don't worry about front, you throw all the runners you can in the game, and then your opponent responds by clearing your last couple of units. Well, now there's a couple of weak units that are on his front. You just march down the board. You put your boomers in front of one of them. You hit end turn, and the game's over. Now, I wish my boomers were level 4 or 5. That would be even easier. But as it stands, I have found it easier to get chip damage in, like significant chip damage, 4 or 8 with booming professors than I found it was than how easy it was for me to get, let's say, 9 out of chestnuts. And I didn't find it all that difficult to get. Well, 9 is incorrect for me, but sorry, 3 times 2, 6. I found it, relatively easy to get 6 points of damage out of my chestnuts. It wasn't that hard, right? Like you just need two things from your own hand, and then you hit end turn and let a unit crash into it. Booming professors, I can get 8. I can get 8 easy. Yeah, I'm not as convinced as you are that you can play around boomers as well as you think you can. I think it's
I'm not convinced that it matters. Now, admittedly, I favor a faster style deck, so if Boomers comes out on 6 mana and clears 1 or 2 units and pings my face, I don't care because I'm trying to set up lethal on 7 mana anyway. It's something that you can outrush, or it's something that you can outvalue in playing like a greedy winter pact deck. I'm just not convinced that it's the problem that you are clearly arguing it is.
Well, I'm not 100% sure that any of the elders themselves were so big of a problem that they were oppressing the meta. What I'm simply saying is if there was a decision that certain cards, elders especially, were a little outside the bell curve of what is an acceptable power level, I just can't believe that Chestnuts gets hit but Boomers gets overlooked. Because I feel like the two of them were give or take in the same realm of, you can rely on these guys to shut a game out even when you've been shut out. Like your opponent plays a perfect, turn defensively to stop any runners. You can't get through. There's no way they're gonna play. They played, I don't know, pick something, Queen into Dreadfawns or something. It's just you're locked out. You won't be able to get through for a turn or two while they march down the. No, never mind. Chestnuts, which is Toxic Sack. Good game, guys. If that was something that, certainly tilted enough players out there, and if that was something that Sheepyard looked at and said, well, that level of interactivity, of that level of lack of interactivity, is just bad for the game. Let's nerf it. Let's try to reduce the playing level of Hairy Chestnuts. I applaud that. I think that was absolutely the right decision, even though I love Hairy Chestnuts. I think for the game, it was the right choice. It was the healthy choice to say, we need to pull this back. It needs not be such an integral part of the game. But if you're going to make that decision, I don't understand why you don't also make that decision about booming professors.
And I'll reiterate my argument that I don't think that anybody was worried about the face damage from hairy chestnuts as a problem. That wasn't a concern. So give me an example of an elder you think is properly balanced.
Okay. I'm going to go against the curve here a little bit, and I'm going to say that Bucks are actually a fairly balanced and well-tuned to the faction Elder. They play along the same lines as Pan Heralds and as Moonlit Airy, right? So it's not they're not dependent on proximity. They can, just like Moonlit Airy, they can buff anywhere on the board. Without movement, they could only do a certain amount. And I think that overall they are on their own. I'll put that caveat in. On their own, they were a balanced card. They were completely broken with Queen, but that's Queen's problem, I think, not Bucks's problem.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I think Bucks itself was a good card. And in fact, we have proof that they were a reasonably balanced card on their own. As soon as Queen got nerfed, you know what happened to Bucks?
They stopped seeing play.
maybe they were a little too balanced, if you know what I mean.
Now, the problem was, like you said, not that the bucks were imbalanced, it's that the queen enabled you to play them for free, and when you get to draw a card and play it for free, that automatically makes it good regardless of how balanced the card is.
Not for nothing, this is exactly the kind of stuff that drove me away from Hearthstone. Just as a quick aside, the whole draw a card or discover a card and reduce its mana to zero is such a broken concept, and Queen, especially high level, tutors two specific cards out of your deck, effectively makes them cost zero and plays them for you. Now, granted, it could play them more efficiently if you actually got to play them. So there is a small amount of drawback to them being randomly played on your behalf, but in reality, when you could drop Dreadfawns and Bucks as an example. And quite frankly, right now, I am still seeing Queen decks out there that are playing, even just Dreadfawns and Doppelbox, just because that much value onto the board is very good. Queen
Yeah,
is still a very powerful card. I don't like that mechanic.
no, that's perfectly understandable, and that's a conversation for another day.
Hmm.
You do see a lot fewer swarm decks running Bucks of Wasteland now than you used to, for sure.
Not Bucks' fault.
No, still a good card. It fits into the swarm style of play where it rewards you for having a wide board. The problem is it doesn't actually move or finish the game for you. So I think that's really why you don't see play anymore. If you're playing it that late in the game, you really want to just kind of close the game out, not just buff a couple other units that are on the board and not dealing damage.
Yeah, if they also commanded them forward, you'd see them play, and that would be busted.
Yes, 100%.
Speaking of cards that fit their faction very well, I'm going to throw something out here as our final little bit of conversation on Elders tonight. I'm going to say Harry Chestnuts does not fit Shadowfen. Prove me wrong.
Interesting. So, Shadowfen is all about draining your enemy strength. That is what hairy chestnuts do. They just, rather than drain it from units on the board, directly drain the base.
Which is not an effect that we've ever seen from Shadowfen before, and I'm going to suggest is maybe outside. So one of the things that you notice very early on in playing Stormbound is that the different factions seem to have, I don't want to call them hard counters, but they seem to have counters, softish to medium density counters. Swarm really doesn't like playing into Shadowfen. Swarm wants to go wide, lots of small minions. Shadowfen explodes them. Toxic Sacrifice, Witches, Crimson Sentry. It's just a bad matchup because so many of the cards within Shadowfen are designed in a way that makes them absolutely terrible when played against Dreadfawns or Doppelbox, right?
Correct.
Shadowfen really doesn't like to see gigantic units or towers. And both of those things tend to be what you see in Winterpact. Also in Winterpact, you tend to see freeze effects, and Shadowfen has no natural way of dealing with freeze effects, right? Like, you can freeze my board as a swarm player, I'll just play Herald's Hymn and the game's over anyway.
Right.
Shadowfen doesn't have that. So Shadowfen is weak to Winterpact's natural mechanics. Suddenly, let's throw Harry Chestnuts into the game, and oh, what do you know? I have a perfect way of, oh, you froze my board? Fine, I'm going to play Harry Chestnuts, Witches, Toxic Sacrifice. I'm going to end the game anyway. I don't know that it was a healthy choice to pick drain your opponent's base as the mechanic for Harry Chestnut. If it was drain all surrounding units like Witches, or drain all poisoned units on the board, like a kind of Amber Hides play, to the next level. There are a lot of options out there for what Harry Chestnuts could have been, but the specific decision to make them drain the base and add a level of chip damage ability to a faction that never had it, I'm not sure that was the right call, and I don't feel like Harry Chestnuts' mechanic really fits that Shadowfen faction.
That's fair. I will say we do see directly damaging your opponent's base as a swarm mechanic, right?
Mm-hmm.
With Vindicators or Mischiefs.
Pillars of Doom.
That does seem to fit the swarm philosophy style of play mechanic a little more. Side note, the ironclad chip damage that we've been talking about from booming professors or overchargers is not chipping directly at the opponent's base. That's why I think it's different. That's just hitting whatever the first unit in front is. And if there is no unit in front, then it damages the base. And that's a different style. And I think that that's a separate conversation.
Yeah, and with push and pull as mechanics within the class, that like location dependency plus these other mechanics is a fun set of things to play around with. Like I think they made good choices with both Swarm's version of chip and Ironclad's version of I don't know what you want to call it, forward damage.
So Harry Chestnut then is pulling that swarm directly chip at the opponent's base into Shadowfen, but also comboing it with the Shadowfen drain mechanic. Shadowfen is really all about countering your opponent's play, right? Like you
Hmm.
either convert it or you poison it or you drain its health. But in all situations, you are interacting with the units on the board, specifically the units that can move on the board and not the tower. And the base being directly chipped down from Harry Chestnuts, I agree with you. It doesn't play into that counterplay theme or design space in the same way that the other elders for the other factions seems to.
I mean, even if you made Harry Chestnuts a witches for all enemies on surviving damage, such that you had to put Harry Chestnuts on your opponent's baseline, but then from there could witches toxac it and drain from your opponent or from whatever other units are next to it. Like that would have been interesting. But from anywhere on the board to be able to chip your opponent's face, I don't know. It doesn't feel right to me.
Yeah, that's understandable. It definitely does feel like an outlier, and that's probably part of what makes it so strong in Shadowfen specifically is that there's nothing else in the faction that can do what it does.
Right. Well, they also were very smart, I feel like, with Faithless Prophets. One thing to recognize in Shadowfen is Shadowfen can deal a lot of damage to its own units. Crimson Sentry, Toxic Sack, Witches, as we've already talked about. And so you don't want to give Shadowfen a particularly strong Elder effect because Shadowfen, more so than any other faction, can abuse it. And
Yep.
so I feel like Chip is one of those you've got to be very careful with it kind of things. But even more so than that, I just feel like it wasn't part of the Shadowfen theme or whatever you want to call it. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up the show. Hope you found this engaging, and I hope the audio quality was a little better than our last one. And again, you know, we always strive each week to try to do better. If you have any thoughts about future shows and what we should incorporate into it, please reach out to us. You can find us obviously in the official Stormbound Discord. You can also find me at Freeloader SB on Twitter. And Subaiku, where can they find you?
You can always email broodsages@gmail.com and give us your feedback there also.
Have a great one, guys, and we'll see you next week.